iNutrition 111 students, let us get started and talk about carbohydrates. I really love this slide because it shows you an array of healthful carbohydrate foods. A theme that runs through this unit is when we talk about carbohydrates or lipids or protein, we really need to consider the type and the source. Carbohydrates provide about half of the calories in most diets. They give us fuel in a ready form, about 4 calories per gram. And when they come from these healthful foods, we also derive nutrients and phytochemicals and all sorts of things that are important for our good health. These are the food groups that provide carbohydrate. You'll notice protein is in this list. It's important to note that the meats are not a good source of carbohydrates, but the plant proteins are. You'll also notice that the empty calorie foods, such as soda and sugar sweetened beverages of other types and candy, provides a lot of added sugar. This is a great concept map. I'm not going to go through these concept maps bit by bit, but I think they're really helpful in terms of helping you scaffold the information, kind of make it make sense. There's a lot of terms in each of these chapters, and this may help you. Okay, so as far as digestion of carbohydrates, the goal for absorption is the monosaccharide. So beginning with the mouth, there is some carbohydrate digestion that stops in the stomach but continues in the small intestine. And the end product for all types of carbohydrate except for fiber is the monosaccharide, which moves into the capillary, out into the bloodstream, and then straight to the liver for processing. So kind of simple in terms of carbohydrate digestion. Let's focus in on the health effects of carbohydrates, and we're going to start with added sugar. We're eating quite a bit of added sugar, and there have been different groups that have recommended that we keep a cap on that. The dietary guidelines certainly do. The American Heart Association recommendation and the World Health Organization are even stricter. And I did mention that the dietary guidelines expert committee recommended 6%. So 10% could be seen as a bit liberal. But why all the fuss? Well, we know that excess intake is associated with all of these problems and more. High sugar diets can also be low in nutrients and fiber that we need to stay healthy. Now, there's a lot of attention being paid to fructose because of the high fructose corn syrup we see in a lot of processed products. There is concern about fructose, that it is, we see, metabolized differently in the liver. It increases the blood lipids that can increase the risk of heart disease. It can lead to fatty liver for sure. We'll talk about that with regards to children, to gout, and it also can get in the way of our fullness signals, which is very problematic in terms of weight management and healthy weights. Now, one of the questions that you might ask is, well, is high fructose corn syrup different than the other sugars? The quick answer to that, and then we will look at this video, the quick answer is, in fact, not much. We can see that high fructose corn syrup is about 42 to 55% fructose, whereas sucrose is 50%. So it's very close. Agave is higher in fructose. We used to think that was a good thing because the blood sugar curve was more gradual, but now we see fructose is not a desirable. High fructose corn syrup's listed, and you can see table sugar there. So I am going to make sure that I have this set up for the video, and then we are going to watch this quickly.
How do you not have blinds? I love select blinds.
So what's the difference between high fructose corn syrup and sugar? Even though it seems like high fructose corn syrup is in every single food and drink wrapped in plastic, you can't find it for sale alone on the shelf. And since there's a little bit of mystery about this stuff, let's take a look at how different these two sweets are and settle this once and for all. High fructose corn syrup made its big-time market debut in the 1970s due to new taxes on import sugars as well as subsidies on corn crops, making it a much cheaper sweetener than regular table sugar. Since then, it's become a pretty standard part of the American diet. High fructose corn syrup doesn't come about naturally, but instead through a pretty advanced chemical process. Corn is milled down to produce cornstarch, which is then further broken down into corn syrup, a product that is almost entirely made up of a sugar called glucose. And while glucose is sweet, it isn't sweet enough to do the job. So in the lab, certain enzymes and acids are used to convert some of the glucose into fructose, which is significantly sweeter. So high fructose corn syrup is a mixture of these two compounds that comes in different variations. Glucose and fructose are what are known as monosaccharides, the simplest kinds of sugars, and also the building blocks of the more complex disaccharides. Now what's important to realize is that common table sugar, or sucrose, is a disaccharide made up of equal parts of glucose and fructose. High fructose corn syrup comes in different concentrations for different products, but it's remarkably similar. The current scientific consensus is that there's almost no nutritional difference between the two. So when it comes to discussing health issues with sweets, it's much less about this than it is about this. When you eat either table sugar or high fructose corn syrup, both inevitably send glucose and fructose into the bloodstream. Glucose charges our cells up with energy, while fructose gets involved with cholesterol and energy-storing glycogen production in the liver. One of the big problems with overconsumption of sweets is that they start interfering with our metabolism and even start playing games with our brain, confusing our sense of hunger and even our feeling of being full. The more sweets we eat, the more possible physical damage they can do to our bodies. Large amounts of fructose, for example, can do a number on your liver and has been directly linked to obesity, heart disease, and diabetes. The American Heart Association suggests that women limit themselves to 6 teaspoons of added sugar per day, while men limit themselves to 9. That's pretty drastic considering the average American consumes around 23 teaspoons a day. So the big takeaway from all of this is to put a cap on your sweets. It'll do you good in the long run. Now on the topic of sweets, check out this video about the cap.
Okay, so the answer is fructose is a problem, but fructose is found in all of these sugars. So whether you're talking about honey or maple syrup or brown sugar or raw sugar, there may be tiny amounts of nutrients, but it certainly isn't anything that will contribute to our nutrient needs. And they are all sugars. Okay, so you can do a little bit more research into that if you'd like, but you need to understand that they all count as added sugars, so they would be counted into those limits. There's a question down here at the bottom of the slide. How many calories are in 1 gram of sugar? And remember, it's 4 kcals per gram. The other thing to remember is to convert from grams of sugar to teaspoons, you divide by 4. Okay, because that becomes important when we look at the American Heart Association guidelines. They talk in terms of teaspoons, and their recommendations are closer to about 5%. So there you see it. 4 grams of sugar equals 1 teaspoon. Divide the total by 4. And we can do that here. And we can see that in a 12-ounce Gatorade Reign, if we divide 21 by 4, we get close to 5 teaspoons, which is almost your limit for a child or for a woman. Okay, and These, of course, are much higher in added sugar. I would like to mention also that ginger ale, okay, as is commonly consumed, is not a healthy soda. In fact, it doesn't even have ginger in it. It is a ginger flavoring, and it has just about as much sugar. I know that is very disappointing to some people, but we need to get that information out there. Soft drinks or sugar sweetened beverages have the sugar concern and even more. One of the problems with soft drinks is that our brain does not regulate them in terms of satiety. So you can drink a big giant soda in the afternoon and it won't take away from the calories you consume at dinner. And we also know that frequently drinking sugar sweetened beverages is associated with a whole host of issues. And that's why there's been campaigns to educate consumers, and there have been policies to discourage the consumption of too much in the way of sugar sweetened beverages. So your textbook has some suggestions for reducing added sugars. I would recommend reading through this because they're very good. I'm not going to read the slide to you at this point in time, but there are a few here that I will mention. There are foods and seasonings that have a sweet taste without being sugar, so that's important. We know that fruits have some natural sugars, but certainly are packed with nutrients and have less sugar than a candy bar, so they're a good replacement also. Be sure to read through table 4.6. The other option for individuals is to use alternative sweeteners, non-caloric sweeteners, and there are quite a few on the market. Many of them, however, have some health and safety concerns, especially if consumed in more than modest or moderate amounts. I always tell students to do the research for sure, but make certain that you're using reliable sources. At this point in time, stevia is looking very safe. So if you consume stevia or Truvia, that might not be a bad option. Okay, so let's talk about a different type of carbohydrate, and that is fiber. Okay, fiber is the structural part of plants that is not digested by our human enzymes. And what's so very exciting about fiber is that it lowers the risk for many chronic diseases, as you can see here, keeps our GI tract healthy as well, and helps us manage both high cholesterol and high blood sugar. So a lot of pluses for fiber. We talk about different types of fiber, soluble and insoluble. Make sure to pay attention to that. Soluble fiber has an impact on cholesterol because it reduces cholesterol absorption in the GI tract. It essentially binds bile and carries it away, and that bile can then not be recycled into cholesterol. So soluble fiber is something that's recommended for people that are trying to lower their blood levels of cholesterol. The other connection between fiber and health has to do with the gut microbiome. We've talked a little bit about that already. Pretty fascinating stuff for sure. What we know is that poorly digested carbohydrates are categorized as prebiotics because they nourish the bacteria in your gut. So one of the recommendations for keeping a healthy gut is to make sure that you consume foods that include these prebiotics, that include the less well-digested carbohydrates. Fiber does have recommendations. You will look at these in your homework and you'll see this on the test. we generally are not consuming enough fiber in this diet in this country. 25 grams is recommended for women and 38 grams for men, and we fall far short of that. I would make mention of the fact that dietary fiber is found in more than whole grains. Remember, fruits, vegetables, legumes, nuts, and seeds as well. In terms of whole grains, these stamps do help. The best, of course, would be to look for grain products that have the 100% stamp, because then you know that all of the grain is whole grain. And here are some tips for increasing fiber. So once again, I would like to remind you that fiber is found in more than whole grains. So this tip focuses on whole grains, but here we have eating whole fruits, snacking on raw vegetables, making sure to have beans a couple of times a week, or some cuisines that include whole grains or legumes. To sum everything up, and you'll be looking at these numbers in your homework, you can see them on your test. The RDA is at least 130 grams of carbohydrate daily for the energy needs of our brain and nervous system, but the AMDR is 45 to 65% of our calories should come from carbs, but less than 10% of the calories should be from added sugars. And we just talked about fiber. Cereal is a great product to connect to our discussion on fiber. And this gives you some tips for how to choose a cereal. You'd like it to be whole grain. You'd like it to not have too much in the way of calories. For instance, some granolas are very dense in calories, and the calories add up quickly. I'm not against granolas, but the portion size is small, so you have to keep that in mind. They should provide a good bit of fiber, and we don't want a lot of added sugars. When we're looking at these two cereals, there's quite a bit of added sugar in both of them, actually. See, 10 grams of added sugar in this, 15 grams in that. And if we focus in on the dietary fiber, we see at least we're getting more fiber here, very little in this cereal. Okay, so we're going to talk a bit about blood sugar and then diabetes as well. Regulating blood glucose is an important process to understand, and the glycemic response index and load are some terms used to describe how quickly blood sugar rises. I think the most common is still the glycemic index. We describe a food in terms of its glycemic index. A high glycemic index food would kick up your blood sugar real quickly, and a low glycemic index food would cause a more gradual increase and a longer curve. And you can see that here. What we know about glycemic index is that choosing lower glycemic index foods, and by the way, they would tend to be foods without a lot of added sugar and with more fiber. They would tend to be less processed and more whole. Improves control in type 2 diabetes and might even reduce the risk of heart disease as well. And some people find that because it gives more satiety, it also can help people manage weight. So these are some tips for lowering dietary glycemic index. Include more oats, barley, and bran, whole grains. Potatoes, except for sweet potatoes, have a higher glycemic index, so eat fewer, lots of fruits and vegetables, and moderate your portion of rice, pasta, and noodles. And by the way, cooking noodles al dente or pasta al dente lowers the glycemic index. Okay, so this is a real quick kind of primer on diabetes. So we're not going to cover this as you will cover it in nursing school or a nutrition program, but we will introduce you to some of the concepts here. So let's look at blood glucose regulation by looking at a quick video. And I need to check my share. Sorry about this. It is good. All right. A quick video about type 2 diabetes, and we will discuss the different types of diabetes in just a minute.
Type 2 diabetes occurs when your pancreas does not produce enough insulin, and your body is resistant to the insulin that is produced. Insulin is a hormone that helps your body use blood sugar, known as glucose, for energy. Your body takes the food you eat and breaks down fat, protein, and carbohydrates for energy. During the digestion process, the carbohydrates from your food are broken down into glucose. Glucose is absorbed into the bloodstream where it is carried to cells throughout your body. A healthy pancreas releases a regular supply of insulin into your bloodstream. After you eat, your blood glucose levels rise, and your pancreas responds by releasing more insulin to move the glucose into your cells. Insulin acts as a key, opening up the cell so it can accept the glucose. In a person with type 2 diabetes, your insulin receptors are less sensitive. Though your pancreas continues to produce some insulin, it is not enough to meet your body's needs. When your body's cells are less responsive to insulin, it is more difficult for glucose to enter the cells and raise your blood glucose level. As a person with type 2 diabetes, it is important to monitor and maintain healthy blood glucose levels. Over a long period of time, high blood glucose levels can lead to serious health complications such as heart attack and stroke, blindness, kidney failure, and nerve damage. By getting daily physical activity, eating a healthy diet, and taking your prescribed medication, you will decrease your chances of developing complications from diabetes.
Okay. All right, so let's take a look at this. It is important to understand the symptoms of diabetes, and this is the onset of diabetes. And you can see here being thirsty, drowsy, having to urinate frequently, blurry vision, increased appetite, these and more. It's also essential to understand that, well, we're going to look at two different types of diabetes right now, type 1 and type 2. Type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune disease, and at the current time, there's not a way to prevent it. It can be treated and it can be managed, but it will require both diet therapy and insulin therapy, and that's very important because the body stops producing insulin. This type of diabetes occurs more often in children, meaning that's when the onset is. But there are some adults with the onset of type 1 diabetes as well. Type 2 diabetes usually begins after age 30, but we've seen more and more children with type 2 diabetes because of our change in lifestyle, less exercise, unhealthy food, more obesity. It is associated with overweight and obesity. And what happens in type 2 diabetes is that the insulin receptors on cell surfaces become insulin resistant. So what occurs is at the beginning, the individual makes a whole lot of insulin in an attempt to kind of trigger those receptors. But as time goes on, they may stop making insulin and then have to take insulin later in the course of the disease. What is really encouraging, two things about this type of diabetes is that because it's primarily a lifestyle disease, it can be prevented even if you see it in your family tree. So attention to lifestyle is extremely important for those who see this in family members. And for individuals who are diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, it can be managed, and in some cases, after weight loss, exercise, better diet, the individual can manage with lifestyle alone and no medications, which is very nice for people. Diagnosis includes the glucose tolerance test, and you see the differences here. And I also want to mention prediabetes. Prediabetes is exactly what it indicates here in the name. It is before diabetes. It's also called impaired fasting glucose, and this is a warning sign of diabetes. What we want is to diagnose people with prediabetes and then help those individuals make lifestyle changes so that they don't advance to diabetes. And lastly, I did want to mention the metabolic syndrome. A metabolic syndrome is a kind of constellation of different issues, health issues that travel together. Okay, so having 3 of these 5 risk factors is called the metabolic syndrome. And you probably know someone with just this. They may have an elevated blood sugar, and they also have high blood pressure, and they also have abdominal obesity. When we put those things together, that's called the metabolic syndrome. And that brings, of course, concerns about health, concerns about a shortened lifespan because of things like stroke, heart attack, etc. Okay, so there you are, chapter, which one are we on? 4. Okay, take care.